Can you hear me now? Yeah. Great. Okay. So I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in Tbilisi. So I've been here not yet 24 hours. So I was suggested that I should speak about the impact of the Soviet nationalities policy on contemporary events, and this is in keeping with the historian's bias of seeking deep historical roots for contemporary developments. But it's not an unusual thing for analysts to look at imperial identity regimes and institutions and their longue durée effects. Many analysts of the contemporary Middle East, for instance, see the privileging of religious identity in constitutional regimes there as having been influenced by the Ottoman millet system. Analyses of Rwanda and Burundi tend to focus on the Belgian colonial construction of racial identities in those states. The British policy of indirect rule and the creation of tribal authorities has its influence in contemporary Pakistani and African events and so forth. So it would not be surprising if we found a similar phenomenon in the post-Soviet space. So the essence of the Soviet nationalities policy as it was originally formed was to support what were called the forms of nationality in order to attempt to prevent the development of separatist nationalism. So there would be national territories, national elites, national languages, national identities, eventually put onto passports, and various national cultural forms, typically of the folkloric nature. And this was combined with the attempt to build a unitary socialist state that naturally impinged upon many of the more important cultural features of the nationalities of the Soviet Union, religion, for instance, being primarily one. So this was not an unsophisticated policy, certainly at the time that it was formulated in the 1920s, although we now recognize that separating out the forms and content of nationalism is a bit of a mistaken notion, and that in many ways nationalism, the forms of nationalism, the discourses of nationalism are constitutive of nationalism, and so the policy ended up in some ways buttressing national identity. In its original form, the idea was that Russian identity would be downplayed and de-emphasized so as to, again, prevent the development of separatist nationalism, so that in the original formulation in the 1920s, the idea was that Russians would in some way remain the imperial people, but would be asked to identify with the entire state and not with a particular Russian culture or with a republic that would be constituted in the same way. The RSFSR was originally a grab bag of republics that was meant to be the Soviet Union, and only in 1922, when the Soviet Union was formed, was the RSFSR sort of left to continue as a remnant of that. This changed in the 1930s, around 1933, when Russian identity was not only rehabilitated but promoted to a primary status, of course, where Russians became the first among equals, as the formulation went in the Soviet friendship of the peoples. And that continued in various ways through to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I want to just point out a few contradictions that this policy kind of institutionalized, and then discuss how they manifest themselves in the 1989 period. So the first contradiction is that nationalism in the Soviet system, nationality, not nationalism, nationality or national identity was institutionalized at the personal level. Everybody had a nationality, which was written in their passports, and at the sub-state level, at the Republican level, at the autonomous Republican level, but it was not anomalously institutionalized at the state level. You couldn't be Soviet as a nationality. When I used to go to the Soviet Union, I don't know if Tim had this experience, but when I was asked what my nationality was, and I would say I was Canadian, I was explained that this was not a nationality, but a citizenship, and I would be inquired further as to what my real nationality was. I always had difficulty successfully finding one. Usually we settled on German, which didn't reflect anything about my own self-conception. So this created a contradiction, because on the one hand, the state was creating something of a Soviet identity, of a Sovietsky Narod. There was a great deal of assimilation going on, but this was not institutionalized or conceived of as national. The second contradiction was sort of built into the policy, as I mentioned, which is that nationally, the republic belonged, in a sense, to the titular nationality. The republic existed in order to embody that nationality, Georgia for the Georgians, Ukraine for the Ukrainians, and so forth. So in some ways, one created the form of an ethnic national republic, but obviously one created that. B, one created something similar for the autonomous republics, and in a case like Georgia, where there were autonomous republics within the republic, one creates a contradiction there, where on one hand Georgia is for the Georgians, and South Ossetia is for the Ossetians, but also the contradiction that, of course, in practice, we are involved in a unitary state where there is no autonomy for the national republic. So one has the contradiction there, and this was managed primarily, of course, by political coercion in the short term. So those are the two kind of contradictions that I would point to primarily at the non-Russian level. I think things function differently, as I said, at the Russian level, because the RSFSR simply did not function in the same way, and that Russians were not encouraged to see the RSFSR as their republic. They were not encouraged to see themselves as a national minority when they were outside of the RSFSR, in a way in which the other non-Russians were minorities within the other republics. So to a considerable degree, Russians could identify with the entire Soviet Union. So in that way, Russian identity was less ethnic than non-Russian identity in the way that it was institutionalized in the Soviet Union. And it led to this ambiguity between Russian and Soviet identity, between Russianness and Sovietness. We were often criticized sometimes in the West when we called the Soviet Union Russia. It's not Russia, it's the Soviet Union. So it was very interesting to me when I started to read Stalin's own internal discussions and papers, and Stalin himself would go back and forth between calling it Russia and calling it the Soviet Union. So the ambiguity which exists with Britain and England was kind of built into the system, and this reflects a longer durée aspect of Russian identity, because it was reflected in the Russian Empire as well, where Russians, on the one hand, could identify with the empire as a whole, or with a kind of ambiguous core identity. So I think that ambiguity in Russian identity is a phenomenon which existed before the Soviet Union, and in some way was further institutionalized by the Soviet Union. So that's some basic structural issues. What about the afterlife of the Soviet nationalities policy? So with respect to the non-Russians, Georgians for this conference, but I think the principles go beyond that. The Soviet nationalities policy promoted an ethnic understanding. If we conceive of kind of an ideal type of ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, ethnic nationalism meaning identifying with a historical ethnic community to which the state belongs, civic nationalism being a nationalism that focuses on your belonging to a given state. The Soviet Union institutionalized, in an interesting way, ethnic nationalism, but did not give it any power. So what one finds with perestroika in the Western and Southern republics, obviously Central Asia has different dynamics, which I will not get into here, were in many ways attempts to take the formal situation and turn it into an actual situation. That is, to create ethnically based republics. Language became the most central issue because language was the area where the Soviet nationalities policy was least abided by. That is, that the Soviet nationalities policy in principle supported non-Russian languages, but in practice involved a great deal of linguistic Russification. This obviously, and I don't need to belabor the point for a Georgian audience, created tensions, where, in particular, where non-titular non-Russians had an institutionalized presence in autonomous republics, such as Abkhazia, Ossetia, ambiguously with Ajaria, and created a sense of threat from those republics and made possible the development of separatist nationalism in those republics, which, in cases where it got outside support, could succeed. But even in areas where it wasn't institutionalized, the Russians of Pridnestrovia, for instance, or Crimea, the same phenomenon could work, and to a considerable degree in the Baltics existed too, although it was managed there since the external power of the European Union was interested in promoting its management. So that, I think, is part of the afterlife of the Soviet nationalities policy, both its institutional effects, but also its cognitive effects, if you will. With regard to Russians, the opposite, I think, was the case. And here, there's a contradiction between the institutional role of the RSFSR and I guess what I'm calling the cognitive sense of nationality. So the RSFSR never functioned in the same way for Russians as a potential homeland, but it did exist as a very important institution. And in the perestroika years, if there hadn't have been a Russian republic, things would have worked out quite differently, undoubtedly. If there had simply been Russian oblasts, and there had been no Central Russian republic for Yeltsin to seize control of and to use in order to destroy Gorbachev's authority in the central state. So in that sense, the Russian Republic played a key strategic role and led to this moment in 1991, which lasted for a very short time, in which Russian elites saw it as useful to get rid of the burden of empire, and in which there was at least a short-term sense in which the burden of empire was something that was burdensome. And the idea of building a Russian nation state had support. Again, it's a very brief time between this and when you get into Soviet nostalgia, within years, I would say. And I think that part of that, again, is the identification of Russia with the larger Soviet Union. Now, this had a positive effect. If what you get in the non-Russian republics tends to be an ethnic nationalism, What was striking in the post-Soviet Russia was the triumph of a sense of civic, of a political civic nationalism, of the Rossiyski over the Ruski orientation. And this has been consistent under Yeltsin and under Putin, I would say. That the rhetoric has certainly been Rossiyski, and the idea of a multi-ethnic state with Russian priority, but with recognized status for national minorities. So one would say that that is, from the perspective of the development of a peaceful post-Soviet state, peaceful post-Soviet conditions was a positive. The negative, as it turned out to be, is that, of course, is that civic and imperial identities, as I mentioned already in the fact that there was an ambiguity already in the Russian Empire between a identification with a Russian ethnic core and a Russian imperial state, is that interestingly, the civic and the imperial identities also have an affinity. And so when we see a triumph of the civic identity in post-Soviet Russia, it does not necessarily mean that we see a waning of an imperial identity. In fact, it's much easier to imagine an incorporation of territories outside of Russia with that identity. And so in that sense, I think Putin's civic discourse is not contradicted in some way by the recent development. So if we're looking at kind of the challenges that the afterlife of the Soviet nationalities policy brings, I think that the challenges are completely the opposite in the non-Russian and the Russian republics. In the non-Russian republics, the challenge is that there's been too strong an ethnic nationalist identification and difficulties, as I believe Stephen was saying, just as I entered in at the end of this session, in developing a successful civic identity that would have to have a successful nationality policy. Whereas in Russia, the problem has been that the civic identity is not coordinate with the borders of the republics, and in some ways that is due to the weakness of